I'm going to start, what we're going to do, I'll go through it very quickly. I'm going to start by introducing Susan Lees of Allstate, and she's going to get up and say a few welcoming remarks, and then Senator Heitkamp and I are going to do a conversation, and then Representative Donna Edwards and I are going to do a conversation. We'll leave some time brief time for questions after each speaker, and then we've got a great panel. I will introduce all the panelists subsequently. I just wanted to say one, but let me introduce Susie Lees right now, because the Allstate Foundation not only underwrites this event, but this very worthy cause as well. Susie Lees majored in political science at Brown University, so I assume she's a loyal RCP reader. She went to law school at the University of Oklahoma. She's been with Allstate since 1988, rising through the ranks, and is now General Counsel and Executive Vice President. She served on Allstate's Enterprise Diversity Council and several outside boards, including the Institute for Legal Reform, the Rand Institute for Civil Justice, and she's a past president of the board of the Riverside Foundation, an Illinois nonprofit offering enrichment to adults with developmental disabilities. So, Susie. So far, so good.
Very well. Good morning, and thank you all for joining us today. This morning, we're going to hear from some of the nation's leading voices on financial empowerment for domestic violence survivors. Thank you to Carl Cannon and Real Clear Politics for arranging such a robust agenda for us. Domestic violence threatens the safety and security of survivors, their families, communities, and businesses. People from all walks of life are affected by this national epidemic that destroys lives and shackles families with despair. Allstate and the Allstate Foundation have put a stake in the ground to stop this tragedy from continuing. But more than that, we're focused on using our core business expertise to help survivors find hope along the path to financial independence. As you can imagine, physical abuse is the type of domestic violence most commonly discussed. But financial abuse, using finances as a tool of power and control, happens just as frequently. In fact, the primary reason a survivor stays in or returns to an abusive relationship is because they, mostly women, but occasionally men, don't have the financial resources to live on their own. Financial stability is central to a victim's ability to live free from abuse. 10 years ago, the Allstate Foundation partnered with the National Network to End Domestic Violence to create a curriculum called Moving Ahead Through Financial Management. The goal of the curriculum was simple: to help survivors get the financial literacy, skills, and resources that will allow them to escape the violence. Through thousands of local domestic violence organizations who teach the Moving Ahead program, survivors have the opportunity to do just that. To date, the curriculum has empowered over 380,000 survivors and their children. We've trained more than 7,200 advocates across 1,700 local programs nationally, and we're working to financially empower 500,000 survivors by the end of 2015. In fact, findings from a new Rutgers University study found that survivors who used this curriculum significantly improved their financial literacy, attitudes, and behaviors compared to survivors who didn't receive the curriculum. The success of this program is a positive step forward, but more can be done. With organizations across the country in need of more resources like Moving Ahead, we need our leaders in Washington to stand up for survivors of abuse. Senator Heitkamp and Congresswoman Donna Edwards are two of such leaders. Thanks to their leadership on domestic violence issues and their vocal support for the Violence Against Women Act, more funding is available to those who need it most. Senator Heitkamp has a long history of standing up to domestic violence, and her work goes beyond her efforts to strengthen VAWA. When she was Attorney General of North Dakota, she built a 5-year program to combat domestic violence in her state. This led to the creation of 17 domestic violence task forces and training programs for roughly 500 law enforcement officials and victim advocates. Congresswoman Edwards, for all intents and purposes, is the mother of VAWA. She was instrumental in passing the original legislation signed by President Clinton more than 20 years ago. She co-founded the National Network to End Domestic Violence and has been a true partner in our cause. Allstate and the Allstate Foundation thank them both for being true champions of women's rights and for helping lead the charge against abuse. I want to thank them and all of our panelists for being here today. Thank you.
I'll just sit here instead of introduce you from here. Thank you, Susie. We're calling this event the Fresh Start, the Road to Financial Empowerment. We're gonna stress that aspect of it, as Susie talked about. But we're going to have a wide-ranging conversation with Senator Heitkamp and with Don Edwards. And before we have our panel discussion, we'll get into all kinds of areas. If you're watching on our website, or if you're going to see this later, we have a couple of students from the University of Northwestern. Where are you? Here we go. They're filming. They're going to do a story on it as well. They're at the Medill School here in Washington. So everybody, you'll be able to see this on our web. We're writing stories about it too. So this won't be the end of it here. Senator Heitkamp, you notice she's wearing orange, so we were talking. She and I have something in common we didn't know about. We both root for the Dutch in soccer. She's a senator, United States senator, so she probably has to say she's rooting for the United States, but the United States didn't wear orange this year. The first female
senator. If they can't win, the Dutch should.
There you go.
Yeah, there you go.
The first female senator elected from North Dakota, Heidi Heitkamp, has been in Washington for just a year and a half, but she hit the ground running. The senator immediately became a leading voice against human trafficking, which is why she's here today. She sits on the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, where she can look out for the interests of her state's farmers and ranchers. She's also on the Indian Affairs Committee, and she's in position to represent the interests of Native American families. I'm going to ask her a specific question about that in a moment. Before I do, let me note that she also served as North Dakota's tax commissioner. Now, tax collector is a title so odious that it's even in the Bible, and they're not even good there. But it didn't hurt her reputation. She ran for Attorney General, where her priorities included extracting a huge settlement from the tobacco companies, $336 million and counting from your own state. 800 now,
but it's more than that.
All right, and keeping sexual predators away from women and kids, even after they had served their prison sentences. All right, my first question. When Americans think of sex trafficking, they tend to think of exotic and faraway places. But you became active in this issue while serving as a law enforcement official in a state most people think of peaceful and safe. When did you realize this was a problem in North Dakota?
Well, the sex trafficking problem has grown exponentially in North Dakota because of the influx of money, young men, and opportunity for not only those that traffic in flesh, but also those that traffic in drugs. And so we're seeing, back when I was Attorney General, if we did an operation where we were investigating a lot of drugs, what we would do is we'd usually trace it back to Chicago, or we'd trace it back to Minneapolis. Now we're going directly to Mexico. That's how much opportunity there is in North Dakota. And with that opportunity comes opportunity for also trafficking in sex. Now, I want to just kind of start out by saying one of the things that we're ignoring in this discussion of human trafficking is not just sex trafficking, but labor trafficking. In fact, if you look at the international numbers, labor trafficking is a much greater problem. And I think we're susceptible to that as well in North Dakota because we have 27,000 open jobs right now. We have zero unemployment. We can't find workers. And so what we have is we have a lot of people who are saying, I'll bring 10, 15 workers to your hotel to have them clean your hotel. Well, who are those workers? What do we know about these women? What do we know about the circumstances of their life? And so it is amazing the parallels between domestic violence and human trafficking. And when you look at it, everyone thinks that it's probably some young girl in a foreign country running blissfully up a meadow, and someone magically snatches her up and gets her into the trade. That's not the path for most women who are trafficked. And women all over the world, including in our country, where 80% of those trafficked are actually our citizens. Women all over the world are susceptible if they are victimized as children, if they are abused as children, and if they come from situations where we have extreme poverty, which makes vulnerability in North Dakota for our Native American women much greater. As you know, Native American women are much more susceptible in terms of rape and abuse, much more impoverished, which is what we're talking about today. It is that poverty element that also adds to a grooming that leads to victimization. And so one of the challenges that we have in Washington is to not just deal with this problem from the front end, but how do you prevent trafficking? Cindy McCain and Amy Klobuchar and I recently went to Mexico. And my role really there was to talk to them about prevention. Where do you see this stopping? Where do you see this pipeline ending? And what they said is one of the surest ways to get prevention is to have victims speak out. Victims to go back to the village and say one simple thing: he promised me the world, and what he gave me was a life of sex trafficking, a life of drugs and abuse. And what happens frequently for families in places like Mexico: I'll help you. Somebody drives in, says, I'll take you to a better life. I love your daughter. And she comes back. She's groomed through drugs and alcohol, and then she's in the life, and with no other place to go. That doesn't just happen in Mexico. That happens in the United States of America. And so we've got to recognize that empowerment at an early age, prevention of sexual assault of children, prevention of exploitation of women, and providing financial literacy. And these combine two of my issues when I was Attorney General, because I did a lot of work on financial literacy when I was Attorney General with older youth, saying you've got to get to know these numbers because you've got to understand how you're going to plan your life independent. And so understanding how we can prevent it, I think, is a huge part of what we hope to do. Providing resources for victims, huge. Prosecution, which is the big part of the bill that Amy and I have kind of advanced, which is providing a safe harbor for women so that they become victims and not felons. And understand this, that the categorization of women as felons limits their financial ability for the rest of their life.
What do you mean? So when they get arrested for drugs or prostitution, is that?
They're charged, and once they're charged, good luck getting an apartment. When they ask you a question, have you ever been arrested? And they don't even ask you if you've ever been convicted. They ask you if you've ever been arrested, and they can find that out. They can do background checks. And so good luck getting a bank account with that on your record. Good luck when you have a bad credit record or no credit record because you've been in a cash business getting any kind of credit. Good luck with a felony record getting a student loan from the government. So what we've done is by giving them the label of a felon, giving them the label of a criminal, has really limited their economic options in ways that really force them to stay in the business. The other complicating factor for a victim getting out of it is frequently these victims have children. And the children need resources. And a lot of times, unintended, what happens when Human Services comes and they say, oh, you have a kid and you're in the life. I guess you won't get to keep your kid. So is she really going to go to law enforcement and ask for help? The other complicating factor, especially in the trafficking area, is frequently these victims have also become recruiters. By that I mean they have gone to the truck stops, they have gone to other women within their circle, other runaways, and they have recruited them into the business. Where does that put them on the spectrum of safe harbor? And so these are very, very complicated issues, and one or two pieces of legislation won't fix all of this. And so we need to stay very vigilant. We need to remain committed to understanding the victimization and committed to helping the victims.
All right, let me ask you another question before I do. For those of you in the back, we have some seats up here. If you just want, don't worry that we're talking. Come on in if you want a seat and have a seat.
There's also some really good food.
Senator, until a recent series of articles in the Washington Post, I'd submit that most federal policymakers were unaware that a non-Indian man who batters an Indian woman on a reservation usually cannot be prosecuted. Congress and the Justice Department, you were active in this, have made first steps towards correcting this injustice. But what more needs to be done?
We need to build out a whole cadre of federal prosecutors as well, because what the crimes are that can be convicted now under VAWA, well, let me back up. VAWA provided an opportunity for tribes to qualify to prosecute other than enrolled members in tribal court for simple assaults.
That's the Violence Against Women Act.
Yeah, misdemeanor crime. Now, you would think, okay, now every tribal court out there now is prosecuting misdemeanor assault. That's not true. You have to qualify your tribal court. And the Department of Justice, I think rightfully so, is moving along very judiciously. They've identified the 3 or 4 tribal courts that will begin this process, because there has to be protections for the victim. And that's part of the exchange that's been done. So what do we do in the meantime in all of Indian country that still can't prosecute these crimes? We have to build out federal prosecution ability, because the federal government has this ability. This is not a new problem. I dealt with this when I was Attorney General. And what we did is we went to the federal courts and said, you need to give us a full-time magistrate to prosecute misdemeanor domestic assault on the reservations. It is not, and I'm not picking on any Department of Justice. They're very busy. They're very focused on felonies. They're very focused on, the kinds of things that you want them focused on, taking down the drug cartels and all of that. But we need, in Indian country, the federal government to focus on misdemeanor assault and prosecute it and identify it and make sure that there is consequences. Because when there is no consequences to a perpetrator, what is the restriction? Going back to human trafficking, you think about this. A lot of the cartels are moving now into human trafficking, the drug cartels. Why would that be? Lower penalties. It's much less severe in terms of the treatment in the federal system for selling a woman than it is selling a kilo of heroin, right? And you can, once you sell your drugs, they're gone, right? You sell a human being, you can continue to resell a human being. So we've got to get ahead of this. And I want to mention this because it's also a dynamic. It used to be that women would have to stand on the street corner, right? I mean, if you were in the business, that's where you advertised you were in the business. It's not how it happens anymore. It happens on the internet, in places like Backpage, and I'll say Backpage. Craigslist has gotten out of this, gratefully. But it's so much more underground than what it's been before, and it's so much less apparent, and that makes it even tougher to get at. So these are challenges. They're not new challenges, I guess. What I would say, they just take on a different kind of attention, and certainly in my state where we have the wonderful opportunities that we do, we also have a lot of cash and a lot of free time and a lot of young men, which makes our state really vulnerable for all of this.
There was a piece, an ABA publication called, Judge's Journal, which went into detail on how sex trafficking often follows domestic battery. Now, you've been alluding to that. The piece was called Traffickers or Batterers. Well, that was one subheading in the article. Is that how sex trafficking begins, in the home? Is that the normal?
I think a lot of it does. And let's just talk a little bit about domestic violence and about what happens to women who are sexually assaulted as young children. I once had an uncle who was involved in some of the first kind of welfare to work programs. It was through the Community Action Program in Moorhead, Minnesota. And he was really piloting for the nation a welfare to work. And I asked him, I said, what's the one thing you would change for these women that would prevent, kind of the need for assistance to begin with? And you know what he told me? He said, I'd stop sexual assault in their houses.
Wow.
Universally, what he saw in that population was stunted growth. And if you look psychologically, at some point when you are abused, you stop evolving. That you have post-traumatic stress. And so we haven't treated this the way we probably should. But sexual assault of children is a problem that leads to a lot of consequences, whether it is the inability to earn a living, whether it is vulnerability for victimization in the sex trafficking, whether it is making you more vulnerable and less secure in marriages and therefore less willing to stand up for yourself when you're being abused. All kinds of grooming that goes on from a very young age. And if we're really looking at prevention, we need to deal with sexual assault of children. We need to deal with exploitation of children at a very early age, because you will see there's a great police officer from Hennepin County who does training all over North Dakota. He puts together a great slide. It's one of his first slides, talking about what he's learned visiting with victims. And so these problems are not, we have to have a very strong law enforcement presence, and we have to prosecute people who exploit human beings, who sell human beings. That has to be among the most heinous of all crimes in our country. But we also have to understand the dynamics and how we're going to prevent it. And how we prevent these crimes is we provide more empowerment on the front end, whether it's economic empowerment or whether it is, in fact, prevention of physical and sexual assault of children.
Senator, Susie Lee's mentioned Cindy McCain, one of the recognized leaders in combating trafficking, and you've met with her many times.
She is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, a tireless advocate. She will go up against anybody. She is Mama Bear on this issue. I just have so much respect for her. She's fabulous.
Well, it's a reminder to me that, this is one of those issues in which partisanship plays no role or should play no role. Have you found it easy to get a bipartisan consensus on these issues in the Senate?
Absolutely. I think Amy started this very early on, and she worked with John Cornyn, somebody that I knew. He was Attorney General in Texas when I was Attorney General in North Dakota, so I've known John for a lot of years, and I know that those of us who did that kind of work, Amy was a prosecutor in Hennepin County. And so think about the backgrounds of the people who have been really involved in this, whether it's Dick Blumenthal, former Attorney General from Connecticut. It's those of us who have been in this fight on domestic assault and domestic violence for a lot of years who see this as a continuation of that fight and understand, I think, the dynamics from years of working with law enforcement, years of working with victims.
Well, how about bicameral cooperation?
Hey, great.
In a few minutes, we'll have Donna Edwards here, but she's from that. She's like you. She's a Democrat, but she's from that mysterious institution, the House of Representatives. Has the Senate been able to work effectively with the House on these issues?
Well, the House has recently sent us over a bill, which I don't know if we've done it by UC or not yet, but it's on track. And so we're going to pass the Safe Harbor bill, which we're excited about. And that actually, the bill that we're going to pass is the bill that the House sent over, but there have been back and forth conversations. I think that we'll be able to do kind of the easy stuff on the front end. The tough stuff is what happens when you have a victim who not only has been, I think we're getting the hook here. What happens
already?
What happens when you have a victim who has been a recruiter, a victim who has been helping in the drug trade? I mean, this gets very, very complicated. What happens when you have a victim who has a child who may have been neglectful of a child? So again, that idyllic view of the victim as this child who has been which is true beginning. I'm not trying to diminish that, but we need to understand who the victims are, and we need to figure out the tough stuff, which is how do we, recognizing the victims that we have, how do we better address the concerns that they have? Because, again, my crusade here really is let's not label people criminals, because the minute you do that, you now have taken away enormous amounts of economic opportunity, and you have kept people in the business as a result.
You know, the Violence Against Women Act was, I covered it at the time. It had a number of co-sponsors, including Joe Biden. It was eventually wrapped into a huge crime bill and signed by President Clinton in 1994. It wasn't considered a big part of that legislation at the time. It's all we talk about now, and it's been reauthorized, and people forget the other facets of the crime bill. This is the one that has stayed, and now it's been reauthorized almost 10 years later. What were the key components of the last year's reauthorization of that?
I think that the fight for Indian women, as much as I've been a longtime advocate for the violence against women, I was not willing to support any bill that didn't include accommodations, didn't include protections for Indian women. I mean, just not going to do that. And I think we were able to get a steadfast group, coalition group, who said basically that. But I want to take you back, because this room is, you know, a lot of women, and a lot of times people say, well, does it really matter if we elect women? I want to take you back to 1992. 1992 was a watershed year for women running for Attorney General. Christine Gregoire, a woman by the name of Pam Carter in Indiana, the first African-American woman elected statewide in the country. Jan Graham from Utah, a pro-choice, pregnant Catholic woman from Utah who got elected Attorney General that year. Me, and then eventually Janet Napolitano, Jennifer Granholm, and we joined Frankie Sue Del Papa, and we joined Mary Sue Terry and Bonnie Campbell from Iowa, who became the first administrator of the Violence Against Women program. So why do I tell you that story? I tell you that story because single-handedly these women changed the agenda of the National Association of Attorneys General. We came, and unbeknownst to any of us, domestic violence was a huge part of how we ran and why we ran. And, you know, I remember going out and talking about why I was running for Attorney General in 1992, and talking about the most violent crime in North Dakota occurred in family, occurred in the home, occurred in trusted relationships. And finally, a very enlightened reporter raises his hand. He goes, enough of those women issues. Are you going to talk about gambling? And I just kind of went right back at him. I said, this is the most serious violent crime that we have in our state. And we need to change the dynamic, because at that time, domestic violence programs were where in state government? They were in public health. This was considered a public health problem. Now, it is, to some degree, still a public health problem. But until we criminalized this behavior, we didn't see dramatic changes. Until we shamed victims. You know, all those guys who couldn't help themselves, all of a sudden could help themselves if their name was in the paper being charged for domestic assault. And so I'm a big believer that in this area, the low-hanging fruit is getting deterrence by actually getting prosecutions. And so we changed the dynamic, and we changed the discussion. And so where we had community policing, we did all those programs that were in the big crime bill. But we changed the dynamic, and I think elevated the concern for violence, and started working with the groups. The advocacy groups were way ahead of us. Working with the advocacy groups to change how people looked at this problem as a criminal justice problem and not just a family issue. And so as a result, I think we've seen some good results, but we aren't done yet. And that whole Violence Against Women Act was a rallying cry, but it was a culmination of years of women advocates screaming in the dark, pay attention. People are dying. People are dying in their homes. Pay attention. And eventually the government did, and we got the Violence Against Women Act, and we got a number of state law reforms that were absolutely instrumental to achieving the change that we want to achieve. We need to continue to not believe that our job is done, but to continue to recognize that if we are going to prevent domestic violence, if we're going to prevent human trafficking, we need to start at a very early age. We need to continue to do the things that we do to empower women and girls. And we need to change the dynamic that women are not property across this world and even in this country. Women and children do not belong to anyone. They belong to themselves.
I promised that I would let you ask some questions. We have, I think, time for a couple of them. Meg, do we? She's shaking her head no. All right, that means
Gone.
No, none from the audience. I promised them. Sorry.
They can get a question.
All right, here's my last question.
Okay.
We're going to talk about this in the second panel, and Representative Edwards and I will talk about it. But I want to ask you, we're going to talk about economic justice and economic abuse. But the tough thing for me to figure out is these women who come here and are trafficked, that's exactly what they're looking for is financial independence. Exactly what they're looking for is a better life financially. So that's what they're seeking. They end up with the opposite. But how do we keep the American dream alive for these kinds of people? How do we keep our borders open to people who just want to come here for a better life without being preyed on?
Well, obviously this is a very sensitive topic right now with the rush to the border, people escaping violence, people, never mind economic opportunity, they just want to have an opportunity to live. And that's really what you see with a lot of the children and a lot of the parents who are actually accompanying their children. We have got to deal with the problem at the source, which is obviously in Central America. We know that we can be successful. When we were in Mexico, it was interesting because Mexico wasn't so much worried about Mexican citizens crossing our border to be trafficked. They knew that they were a conduit for Central American victims. And so all of those children who are unaccompanied are potentially very vulnerable to trafficking, very vulnerable, probably already have been victimized in ways that we wouldn't even want to imagine. And so what I would say is we need comprehensive immigration reform. We need to decide as a country what we'll do in terms of asylum for people who are victimized in this way. And these are bigger and broader issues than just kind of, here's the 5 things we need to do. I think we need to build consensus around what the role of our country is going to be in our hemisphere in combating these kinds of problems.
Well, with that, I just wanted to thank you again. It's been an honor.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Yes. Thank you so much.
I'm going to take this.
Yes.
I already sucked on it.
Okay. All right. Welcome.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm great.
All right.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm going to introduce you, and we'll get right to it.
The senator's chair.
You got your own cup? Good.
I do.
I'm going to just start right in. If anybody wants to grab a seat, there's a couple up front here. If you're in the back, Taylor, come and have a seat with us. He works for me, so he'll probably do it. And we'll give just a moment for the room to get settled. You've noticed that Senator Heitkamp has been replaced by Representative Donna Edwards. Donna Edwards.
I like the way that sounds.
Yes. That's you're doing good work in the House, don't you? Donna Edwards was a community activist before community activists were cool. Well, maybe not, but before one worked in the Oval Office. Elected in a 2008 special election, she became the first African-American woman to represent Maryland in Congress. Representative Edwards worked last year on the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. My first question to her will be on that process. But she had extensive experience on this legislation before entering elective politics. As executive director of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, she was a co-founder of that organization. She was involved in the 1994 fight to pass the bill that Senator Heitkamp and I were discussing, the one signed into law by President Clinton in that year. As a kid, she traveled the country. Her dad was in the Air Force.
That's right.
And graduated from high school in New Mexico, went to Wake Forest, worked for a time at Lockheed at the Goddard Space Center, went to law school in New Hampshire. It's no wonder where she focused on special interest law. Her travels introduced her to all kinds of Americans. It's no wonder you once told the Washington Post that there's not a room I go in where I feel like a stranger.
That's true.
All right. And she's no stranger to the issues we'll be discussing today. That is to say, economic pressures on women and children. After separating from her husband, she and her son were briefly homeless. So she practices what she preaches too. She's involved in other issues, including climate change, and she once plunged in the Potomac River with other climate change activists in January. On this in July, it wouldn't be so bad, but you can imagine. In any event, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
The question I'm going to start with you is the one that I left off with Senator Heitkamp, talking about bipartisanship. A year and a half ago, you and Representative, does she pronounce her name Jamie Herrera Butler?
Jamie Herrera Butler from Washington.
Yeah, she's a Republican who co-chairs, along with you, the Congressional Women's Caucus. And the two of you issued a statement urging reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act in a bipartisan way. But I heard that you both received some pushback in your own conferences. Is that true?
We did. And I think part of it was born of our experience. Hers as a legislator in Washington and mine as an advocate. And our experience had been domestic violence had really never been a partisan issue. And so that really troubled us a lot. And what we decided to do was to issue this letter without saying, here's the prescription, here are the details, because we knew that could break down, but urging work on that. And I think it was helpful really for the advocacy community. That's the way I think, right? So what can we do in Congress that gives the advocacy community some leverage out in congressional districts to compel us to act? And that's what that letter did. And I think, it is true. We did both get a little bit of pushback, not a lot, but a little bit.
Why? Why would that?
I think because at the time, the way that the fight had broken down was over really partisan lines because of who would be covered under the new reauthorization. Were we going to cover people on tribal lands? Were we going to cover fully the LGBT community? And these can tend to be really partisan kinds of fights. And we just thought for anyone who's experiencing domestic violence, you're not going, oh, am I a victim? Do I want to be a survivor? And am I a D or an R? You want to get out of the violent situation. You want the services provided to you wherever those services are necessary. And you want to see law enforcement act in a way that is responsible, whether that is on tribal lands or it is in cities and communities across the country. And so we just felt very strongly about that. It was the right move. I think the advocates, I really want to credit them because they went back out into congressional districts all across this country. And one of the things I loved about being involved in the movement is that we had advocates everywhere. Couldn't touch a single congressional district without an advocate there. And they made the case to our members of Congress who came back to Washington compelled to act without controversy, and that's exactly what happened.
So it was a grassroots effort.
Absolutely.
You were involved, when you were in the grassroots, you were involved in this issue, as I mentioned, before getting into politics. Why did you pick this issue? What was it about it that grabbed you?
Well, I'd had a couple of experiences. As you noted, I grew up in a military family, and anyone who's lived in military housing, you know that the walls are really thin. And when I was very, very young, we were living in Ohio, and we shared, my sister and I shared a bedroom that was right next to the neighbor's master bedroom. And almost every single night, we heard the violence that was taking place next door. And then there were times when my father would call military police. There were times where we would see, and we were friends with, obviously, with our neighbors and their children. And I remember how it struck me as a young girl. At first, I thought that the woman who lived next door was just really fashionable. She'd wear these big, dark sunglasses. She'd wear scarves around her neck. She had really heavy makeup. And I didn't realize or think about it until I was much older about what she was doing, and she was covering up the violence,
the bruises,
and the psychological damage, and that stuck with me as I grew up. And then, of course, we know that violence impacts 1 in roughly every 4 women, and so I think there's none of us that, if we really think about it, who haven't had people in our lives who've experienced violence. And when I went to work at Lockheed, I had another very revealing, had an experience in college, which led me to start some services for young women at Wake Forest University because of a young girl who lived on a hall where I was the residence advisor, and she was being beaten up by her football player boyfriend. And so these experiences really led me to want to do the work. At work, I remember I was volunteering, at a hotline, a domestic violence hotline. And I would bring cards to my day job at Lockheed every day, and I'd sit them on the side of my desk. And the woman who shared the cubicle with me took one of those cards. And one night she called me in January when it was cold. She was naked in a phone booth, having been beaten and thrown out of her house by her then boyfriend and then husband. And she called me, and I went to get her. And it was those experiences that said, I really have to do something on this issue, and not just about providing services, but from a system perspective, making sure that all of our systems work, law enforcement and prosecution, that our judicial system works for victims and for survivors, and that we have the kind of services that are out there that allow women and their children to get back on their feet and to live their lives without violence.
Now, we've been talking about these very serious issues, but we are still real clear politics, so I'm going to veer just stick my toe into politics and ask you. Senator Heitkamp gave me an opening just before you came here. She said that it showed that talking about these issues, and she went back to her Attorney General days, shows why electing women to public office is important. And so I guess the question I would ask you is, would electing a woman to the highest office in the land help with these issues?
No question about it. I thought you were going to ask me a really tricky, difficult question.
No. It's not that kind of event.
I was getting prepared.
No. Well, all right. I'll take that challenge. Do you have a specific candidate in mind?
Well, I think we all have candidates in mind. I would say, people ask about Hillary Clinton all the time, and so that's not a great secret. And I look at her breadth and depth of experience, and I can't think of anybody else, man or woman, who's run for public office who has that kind of breadth and depth. And so why not? Why wouldn't she be at the top of the list?
Well, I'm going to make everybody knows me, and even if you don't, you can already tell I'm famously nonpartisan. But if you for many years, if you Google the phrase, why not Hillary, I think my name will still come up. I wrote a piece for Washington Monthly many years ago. I didn't see Barack Obama coming, I'll admit. Anyway, so yeah, why not?
And I think we have a lot of great men out there who would make terrific presidents, but it seems to me that in the 21st century, this part of the 21st century, that it really is just time. And I've been chairing recruitment for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee this cycle. We've recruited more women as Democrats than we've ever had in our history. They're at the top tier of our list. Women are ready to lead, and I think the American people are ready for women to lead.
Well, the polls show that you're right on that question. Let me get talk about bipartisanship. The first event that we held, it was on Capitol Hill. Was it at Charlie Palmer's? Who remembers that? Yeah, it was with Buck McKeon, Republican, who chaired Armed Services Committee, and we were talking. The sequester was looming then, and the chairman made some news there. I pressed him on this. I did ask him some tough questions about the budget process, and he basically said that he thought that defense spending had been cut to the bone, and that any further cuts was really not in the interest of the country. And he'd convey that to his own leadership. You gave a speech, I think it was a couple of years ago, about what you thought the sequester process was doing to these programs that protect women and children. And I wanted to ask you about that. That was an example where you were bucking really both parties when you were saying this, because both parties agreed to it initially. Is the money been restored to your satisfaction? Is there more money, more federal money that needs to go into the programs prescribed by the Violence Against Women Act?
No, it hasn't really been restored in that way, and I think it's really unfortunate. And the sad thing is that when you make investments, and we know this around the world, when you make investments in women and children and their safety and security in their homes, it turns into an economic boom. And so it doesn't really make sense to cut those programs. And I did vote against the sequester, and I think I've actually been proven right on that, even though we were in the minority, those of us who voted against the sequester. And I think other things like, you make investments in roads and infrastructure and in science and technology and in education. Those things pay off economically in the same way that making certain that women and children, those who experience violence, in fact, are safe in their homes. They produce more economically. And so I think it's a financial gain for us to make those investments. And it's, it's a value statement. What do you feel about women and children and their safety and about them being able to thrive in an environment without violence? That's a value statement. And so for me, the positive value statement is increasing those fundings for shelters, programs, services, the judicial system, law enforcement, and training, and all of the gaps that we know need to be filled.
The history of domestic violence, first you had to make it actually against the law. Then you had to stigmatize it. And then you had to deal with women who wanted to leave but couldn't leave for psychological reasons. And we haven't solved all these problems, but there's progress has been inexorable. But the next sort of frontier, it seems to me, and we'll be talking about this in the panel. I hope you can stay. You can see I have an illustrious panel, people you all know. But let's talk a bit about economic justice. It seems to be the next place that the advocacy goes. It's just empowering women once they've left to stay gone from an abusive situation, or to avoid a situation like that altogether. What can the government do? What should the government be doing in this aspect of the fight?
Well, I think in this aspect, it's actually an amazing opportunity for government and the private sector to really step up as partners in how we provide the kind of financial foundation and understanding of finances and resources that enable women to make decisions that allow them to live free from violence. And think how many people stay in abusive relationships because they won't be able to afford a mortgage on their own or rent on their own or child care, which is the single largest expense, even above a mortgage, that many families face. And they're making decisions about their personal safety because of these financial circumstances. So the government can provide for avenues for training opportunities around financial literacy, can provide for opportunities for deferring expenses, taxes, those kind of tax treatments that constrain, and I say a woman, I understand the breadth of domestic violence, but constrain a woman's ability to move on. Even things like mortgages that partners share jointly, a way to sever those in a way that enables a woman to continue to have her home or to be able to purchase another home without the financial burden because she is sharing that mortgage jointly with an abusive partner. And these are all areas where the federal government really has an opportunity to step up. And then our partners in the private sector, whether it's our banks, our insurers, and all the rest, stepping up to say, here are the things that we can do in our own industry that actually provide an opportunity for women to live free from violence.
Well, the president illustrated this every October. The presidents started when Bill Clinton was president. George W. Bush did it. Barack Obama's done it. It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and this president had a woman. She spoke, and she was there, and he called her by name. She was in an abusive relationship. Her husband beat her. She got a divorce. She got out of it. But the last thing, he'd wrecked their credit, and she couldn't hire a lawyer to fight for custody of her children.
Yeah.
And she finally found an advocacy group, probably one of your groups, who did it. But you talk about a need.
Well, that's right, and having courts understand that, and judges able to make decisions that would free up at an early stage those financial resources that are joint resources that would enable a woman to fight for custody of her children, to fight to clear her credit, and to fight for her home. So I think that there are plenty of things that we can do, and this is a real opportunity for us. And we say we have Domestic Violence Awareness Month in October, but in my view, every month for every American is Domestic Violence Awareness Month in your communities, in your homes, in your jobs, your neighborhoods, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. because we still have a long way to go. And because we don't talk about it enough, there are still an awful lot of people who are living in silence and in shame when they don't need to still. Opportunity for bipartisanship, too. Greater opportunities for bipartisanship. And the the Violence Against Women Act, can you imagine around the table, Orrin Hatch, Joe Biden, John Conyers, Connie Morella? I mean, it was truly Joanne Emerson.
That's how this town used to work.
That's how it used to work. And you know what? It can work that way again.
Thank you. I promised, and I'm going to keep my promise this time, if there are any questions from the audience, this is your time. Meg, do we have microphones or anything like that? If we don't, I can repeat the question. Okay. You don't mind taking a couple of questions?
Not at all.
All right. Let's start. Show of hands, please. Over here, Grace Cerrone. Can you see? Keep going. You'll see. There you go.
Hi, thank you. I'm Grace Cerrone with My Democracy. What can constituents do? What can the average American do to help support, not only bipartisanship in Congress about this issue, but just in general and within their communities, but also to help their legislators?
Well, I think there are plenty of things to do. So, for example, in my community, there's only, in Prince George's County, right outside of Washington, there's only really one domestic violence shelter in the county, and it struggles financially all the time. And so we can do that by, supporting and raising, funds for those shelters. And I say shelter speaking broadly because they're shelters and programs, really comprehensive programs. In our schools, for example, we can begin to teach our children tools to deal with issues in conflict that don't involve violence, and then in ourselves demonstrating that. And you know what? They say if you see something, say something about other kinds of things. If you see something, say something. Because the phone call that you make on behalf of a neighbor, the reach that you make out to a neighbor in your community, or if you're in the medical profession and you're doing your examinations and talking with women as they come in for medical services, making sure that you ask that question so that you can identify, and then hopefully that then leads to services, and hopefully that then leads to living a life without violence. And so I think each one of us can figure out a way that there's something that we can do to support things in our own communities and neighborhoods that can really make a difference, in your own workplace that can really make a difference.
Thank you. Who else has a question? Adam, this is your chance. Nope. He's covering this for us.
Hi, Adam. I feel left off the hook.
He asks very tough questions, so you can ask Harry Reid about that. So it's just as well. All right. Well, I'm going to make a very brief announcement. We're going to let. Can you stay, or do you have to go?
I have to.
You have to go. All right. We're going to let her go because she has important work for the Republic. But we're going to take just a minute. We're going to get 3 more chairs up here. I want you all to stay. I've got, we have Kim Gandy, president of the National Network to End Domestic Violence, Chelsea Parsons with the Center for American Progress, Judy Posmus, who's doing cutting-edge work, research at Rutgers, and Dara Richardson-Heron, who's MD, Chief Executive Officer of YWCA. They're all going to be up here, and we're going to talk about economic justice. I quipped in my morning note that some of you get this morning. I was thinking about this group, if I would have all 6 of them here. And briefly, while Heidi Heitkamp was here, and when you came in, all 6 of these women were there. And it reminded me of John F. Kennedy's famous quip about he had the Nobel laureates together for dinner at the White House, and he said something like, "This is the greatest gathering of talent that's ever been in this room, with the possible exception when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." So in that spirit, I think we have a gathering of experts and advocates and wisdom on this issue together in one room, unlike anything else, with the possible exception of when Eleanor Roosevelt dined alone.
Well, I'm sorry I'm going to miss our panel because I so admire these women and the work that they do, and what a contribution to the nation, and it doesn't have anything to do with being in electoral politics.
Well, you helped start it, so thank you so much. It's been an honor. All right, I'm going to introduce the panel now, but I'm going to start at the far end because I butchered the pronunciation of Judy's name. It's Postmus, and she's a Dutch woman also. So we had 3 people who were secretly rooting for Holland's soccer team this year. Judy Postmus is an associate professor at the School of Social Work at Rutgers University. She's also a founder and director of the Center on Violence Against Women and Children. Her research is on physical, sexual, and economic victimization experiences of women, with her most recent attention given to understanding how economic empowerment curriculum improves physical and mental health functioning of battered women. This work is really the inspiration for this event, so I'm going to direct the first question to her. But before I do that, I'm going to introduce Dara Richard Herron, CEO of the YWCA USA, one of the nation's oldest and largest multicultural organizations promoting solutions to enhance the lives of women, girls, and families. A medical doctor, she joined the organization after 2 decades of leadership and management experience in the healthcare, corporate, and nonprofit sectors. Dr. Richardson Herron represents the YWCA on Capitol Hill, at the White House, and in the media. She meets regularly with key stakeholders, including elected officials, coalition partners, corporations, donors. To my immediate left is Kim A. Gandy, President and CEO of the National Network to End Domestic Violence. She brings to this conversation a long career in advocacy in this field, ranging from prosecuting violent offenders and assistant DA to working for passage against the Violence Against Women Act and volunteering at a local shelter. She was a founder and director of the New Orleans Metropolitan Battered Women's Program in her native Louisiana. Prior to joining NNEDV, she served in leadership positions for the Feminist Majority, the Feminist Majority Foundation, where she led their successful campaign to modernize the FBI Uniform Crime Report definition of rape. If you are a political writer, as I am, you remember her as an effective organizer and spokeswoman for the National Organization for Women, where she spent 22 years ultimately as president. And to her left is Chelsea Parsons, Director of Crime and Firearms Policy at the Center for American Progress. Her work focuses on advocating for progressive laws and policies relating to guns and the criminal justice system at the federal, state, and local level. Before that, she was General Counsel to the New York City Criminal Justice Coordinator, a role in which she helped develop and implement criminal justice initiatives and legislations in areas including human trafficking, sexual assault, and family violence. Chelsea works mostly at the Center for American Progress on gun issues lately, but she agreed to do this, and she did that without me promising to ask a gun question, but I will ask a gun question.
Excellent. I was going to slip it in anyway.
Okay. Well, let me start. Professor Postmus. I remember covering this issue as a young police and courts reporter in California when it was seen as a criminal justice issue. But the conversation quickly became more complicated as experts had to make police officers and judges understand how difficult it was psychologically to separate women from their batterers. Your research seems like the 3rd generation. Even women who've broken away from an abusive relationship drift back into it because they're economically shackled. First of all, can you define an economic abuse for us? And then explain a little bit how your research led you to this aspect of the problem.
So economic abuse is not a new issue for the advocate community. They've been talking about economic abuse. If you look at the traditional power and control wheel, there's a slice of it that focuses on economic abuse. But from a research perspective and an understanding and even a policy perspective, there hasn't been much attention given to that topic. In fact, it's usually been blended in with psychological abuse. And so it wasn't until conversations with the Allstate Foundation and their work on developing an economic empowerment curriculum that we started looking at economic abuse. And what we found is that there's 3 different forms of economic abuse. One is what we would call economic control, where an abuser uses or controls the money in the relationship, makes all the decisions without any input from the victim, makes her account for every single penny that she spends, and keeps her tied to not being able to make any financial decisions. And then there's economic exploitation, which you referred to earlier, the ruining of credit, the running up of debt, the opening up credit cards in her name, without her knowing about it. And so it's, again, a way of exploiting her economic standing so that her credit score goes down or becomes, non-existent, and that she has financial difficulties. And then the third way that we've found economic abuse is from sabotaging of employment opportunities. So whether it's preventing her from going to work, sabotaging her, destroying clothes before she goes to work, slashing tires in the car so it prevents her from going to work. Or even things like harassing her while she's at work and getting her in trouble where, you're not supposed to get phone calls from family. And, he consistently calls her and she ends up losing her work. So those are three different ways that, different forms of economic abuse. And I think that this is, again, as a researcher and a former advocate in the domestic violence field, we have focused a lot on the physical violence. Emotional abuse also got some attention. But I think the economic piece, because we know that women list economic reasons as one of the major reasons they don't leave or they have a hard time leaving.
Is it tied in? Is it a third kind of control? I mean, do they go together? Is a woman who's being abused in this way also being physically abused typically?
Well, the research is so limited because we've really just started looking at it. We did find in some of our analyses of some of the data we've collected that economic abuse is a distinct form of abuse. It is not just under the rubric of psychological abuse, and that it should be something that is studied separately and distinctly different from all the other forms of physical, sexual, or psychological abuse. What we found in our study and talking with women and across this country is that we found that they did go together. There was a correlation between the different forms of abuse, that women who experience physical abuse would experience economic abuse, but we don't know for sure that it happens every single time. Anecdotally, and from my experiences as an advocate, I would say it's there. I mean, it's another way of controlling somebody, and economically, and money is certainly a huge way to control someone to keep them in the relationship.
Kim, you're nodding. Let me address a question to you. It strikes me as that this form of abuse is particularly pernicious because it almost prevents the woman from leaving.
Well, and that's exactly what it does. The whole concept of domestic violence is based in power and control. And some use physical abuse to maintain that control. Some use fear and threats, psychological abuse. But financial abuse is just as effective at trapping a victim as a lock and key. Because if her credit's ruined, she can't get an apartment, she can't get utilities turned on. If he's caused her to lose 2 jobs, who's going to hire her now? If you've been fired from 2 jobs, how are you going to get another job? And so it is a way literally of tying her to the relationship and maintaining the physical power over her because she can't leave, and he's now made it impossible for her to leave financially. And that's where we come in. That's where the all-state curriculum that was developed between National Network to End Domestic Violence and the All-State Foundation developed this curriculum to work with survivors to help them accomplish the things they want to accomplish, which is to be able to have the economic independence to break free and live safely.
Is there a role for government?
Yeah, of course. There's always a role for government. There's the opportunities for...
I mean, in this curriculum,
yeah, in this, well, certainly. I think, but in every step along the way, we go back years to the opening of shelters. The first shelter I worked in, we literally kept open with a garage sale every single Sunday until the Family Violence Prevention and Services Act in 1984 finally provided actual funding so that you could have a professional staff at the shelter and not just a bunch of motley volunteers who didn't know what they were doing but were just doing the best they could to try to keep victims safe from abuse. But it was the government stepping in and providing funding that made that possible, and funding at a level that's impossible for any corporate foundation to do. Allstate was here to develop the curriculum within an EDV and now to deliver it to almost 400,000 survivors. But there are millions of people who need this, and no corporate foundation can do that. There really is a role for the government to make that possible.
Doctor, I want to ask you a question. If I'm correct, the YWCA is the largest provider of domestic violence services and women's shelters in this country.
That's correct.
So that, when we think of shelters, we think of an emergency situation, leaving in the middle of the night, the way Donna Edwards' friend called from a phone booth, beaten, half clothed. But when they settle into the shelter, they're there a few days. I mean, at what point does what hit them, what Kim and Judy have been talking about, where will I go? Well, I've got no money. I've got no job. I'm really, even here, I'm trapped. What's the next step your organization does? How do we begin talking to victims who seemingly escaped their batterer, but maybe haven't yet?
Well, first of all, at the YWCA, we think it's very important that when they come to our doors, we provide them with a safe haven. Many of these women, it's for the first time, when they walk into our doors, it's the first time they felt safe in years. So we don't immediately go into having discussions about, financial empowerment or, what you're going to do next. We meet them where they are. And quite frankly, it's different for every woman. And these women are smart. They recognize that, this is just the beginning of their journey. And what we do at the YWCA is begin to make sure that we are providing them with the tools they need to lead a much more safe and productive life. So, after they've settled in, after they've had a nice meal, a bath for many of them, we begin to talk to them about what are their circumstances. What can we do to not re-victimize them? Because these women, again, have had, an incredibly exhausting life, and they've now taken a big step, which, for many of them was one of the most challenging times in their lives. So we start talking to them about their education. What are their opportunities for job training? Thanks to the great people at Allstate, we are able to talk to them about their finances. What is their current financial situation? We talk to them about their children. Many of them come not just by themselves, they come with children. Some of our YWCAs actually have schools that are specifically designed to address the needs of children who themselves have been either victimized or have witnessed the abuse. We try to focus on not just, the here and now, but we try to focus on what is the whole trajectory of this family's life. And we don't just have emergency housing. We have long-term housing. We have transitional housing. And we actually, hopefully, if we do our job well, we prepare these women to go out and live independent lives. But it is a journey, and it starts with that first step and when they come into our facilities.
Chelsea, I wanted to ask you, when we're discussing survivors of domestic violence achieving financial independence, you and I talked about this yesterday. There's this implicit assumption they'll be able to earn an income. Can you talk about some of the challenges domestic violence survivors face in the workplace, what type of policies and practices you think should be implemented to ensure that they're able to hold a job while maintaining their safety?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly right. When we're talking about survivors being able to achieve economic and financial independence, that means they need to be able to work. And they need to be able to work in a workplace that is both physically safe for them and is responsive to their specific needs as survivors. And there's a lot of work to be done here. And I know that you folks are really leading that fight. We know that the workplace continues to be a venue for harassment and abuse for a lot of different reasons. And as you mentioned, it's a way of perpetuating the violence. It's a way of continuing to control, to create problems in the workplace that often can cause a survivor to lose her employment. It's also a venue often where an abuser has relatively easy access, particularly in situations where you have a survivor who has left the home, who has moved to a shelter, to a confidential location, but she may have kept her same job. So he knows that that's where she can be found. Often workplaces are in environments that are very open to the public. So even if a survivor has a protection order that's a stay-away order, it can be very hard to enforce that if you have somebody who works in a mall or in a large office building with a lot of different businesses in that building. And so these are just some of the reasons why the workplace continues to be a site for harassment and stalking, and even for physical violence. And we've seen a number of really kind of horrific acts of violence that have occurred at workplaces. And this is kind of where my gun hat comes on a little bit. I've got 3 cases that I know a number of you know of. We have Zena Daniel, who was gunned down by her ex-husband at the spa where she worked, and she was killed along with 2 of her co-workers in Wisconsin. Jackie Wisniewski in Buffalo was murdered in a stairwell of the hospital where she worked by her ex-boyfriend, who was also a physician there. Jitka Vessel was murdered by her ex-boyfriend in the parking lot of the office building where she worked. And so not only is the workplace a scene of kind of daily ongoing harassment and stalking through the phone calls and through showing up, but it can be a scene where the violence culminates in a fatal episode. And so that's why it's really important not only to be focused on how we can empower survivors to be able to take control of their financial security, but we need to put the onus also on employers to be creating workplaces and having in place workplace policies that allow survivors to continue working and to maintain safety. So there's a couple policies. This is not news to any of you guys. You guys are very much the experts on all of this. But I'll just run through a couple things really quickly. Very basically, workplaces should have domestic violence workplace policies. And I've seen the statistic. Only 15% of employers do, as part of their workplace policy, have a specific policy relating to domestic violence.
Chelsea, slow down there for a minute, because that's interesting. What would some of those policies consist?
Well, so the very basic premise I would submit to a domestic violence policy would be a basic non-discrimination policy, which is that you cannot be fired for being a victim of domestic violence. And the vast majority of states, as my understanding is, do not have a state law protecting survivors from being fired because of their abuse. And so you have a situation where you have a woman who her abuser comes to the workplace, creates a huge scene, has to be arrested and escorted away, and then she'll be fired because she caused that.
Ostensibly for the safety of the other.
Correct, exactly. Part of a domestic violence policy should account for reasonable accommodations for safety. There are some really easy things that employers can do to help maintain the daily safety of a workplace. Change her phone number, change her email address, move her desk. If she's a receptionist who sits at the front door, adjust her work situation so that she's not the first face, so it's not so easy for him to come in and harass her at her desk. Screen phone calls, offer the opportunity to have any phone call directed to her screened through somebody else first. Offering an escort to parking lots. There's a lot of parking lot stories, a lot of laying in wait in a parking lot, and so just providing for an escort, to and from parking lots. And these are things that this doesn't cost an employer anything, and it doesn't take away from a workplace environment to do these very simple things to help your employees maintain safety. Training for not only for management and for human resources, which is crucial, but also just training for the staff across the board about kind of just very basic dynamics of domestic violence, how it can affect the workplace, what is an appropriate response to a coworker who is going through a situation, what is not an appropriate response from a manager to an employee who is having experiencing a domestic violence situation. And employers should really be developing relationships with local service providers who can help, folks at the YW can help employers come up with an appropriate workplace policy that can help their employees who are survivors maintain safety and maintain their employment. So it's really basic things that really, again, aren't going to cost employers anything, but will help create this overall workplace culture that is conducive to a survivor feeling that they can approach their employer and say, I'm experiencing this. I need these accommodations so I continue to work.
All right, let me get back to this research for a minute that Rutgers has done and what Allstate has done. Kim, I'm going to ask you about the Allstate, some of the curriculum, the highlights of it. And Judith, I want to ask you specifically about what your research is finding that you think that shows what works best. First of all, what are the highlights of this curriculum as you see it? What are the most important features of it?
Well, the curriculum that we developed with the Allstate Foundation helps survivors begin to identify what they can do to repair the damage that has already happened
to their lives.
In their lives, how they can begin to repair their credit, how they can get their credit report and examine it for things that don't belong there, debts that they didn't create, how they can write a letter to request that something be removed from their credit file, how we can support them to do that. And it really goes step by step through all of the different ways that she can repair the problems that were created, and then how to move forward to live on what is likely to be far less income, developing a budget, opening a bank account, dealing with areas that have been a source of harassment to her, like having a credit card, right? She's afraid to have a credit card because he has run up debt on her card. Maybe she can't get a credit card at all because he's run up so much debt on her card. So how does she then begin to create a credit profile for herself so that she can get an apartment, so that she can have utilities turned on? And it really is a process of going step by step with survivors to repair the damage that's been done, but also to help them have the economic security and stability that they need to move forward.
Judy, what does your research show? What works in this area?
So when we did the research, we decided to do a randomized control study so that we had a group of survivors who were randomly assigned to either get the curriculum through as an experimental group or to not get the curriculum, and then compare the results between the groups, as well as to compare the results over time. And so we followed women for 14 months and interviewed them 4 different times on a number of areas, financial areas, including things like their financial behaviors or their attitudes about finances, or their knowledge about financial literacy. And what we found that over the 14-month period, that survivors who received the curriculum did significantly better than on every financial variable, that they did better with their behaviors, attitudes about finances, with their intentions to perform certain financial management, to even their self-efficacy or their confidence in managing finances. And we also saw a significant decrease in their financial strain. So all of this, so for example, 94% of the women at the end of the study period of 14 months reported that they learned how to identify signs of economic abuse, compared to the 54% who knew it at the first time at the pretest. 90% of the women learned how to create a budget. 80% of the women started paying their bills on time as a result of learning the curriculum. 71% at the end of the 14 months learned how to and knew how to invest in savings, everything from a basic savings account to even more advanced savings such as retirement accounts and so forth. And so it's remarkable how much the curriculum impacted the lives of these women. And it wasn't even just the impact, short-term impact in the sense of 1 or 2 months, but a 14 months, almost a year and a half impact that continue to improve their financial standing and their financial life.
Right. For those of you who weren't able to memorize all of those statistics, we have a story on our website on Real Clear Politics this morning by Caitlin Huey Burns, who covers. It's in here. You also have it here. Okay. Anyway, so quoting from this study, and you're welcome to consult the website and commit those to memory. I want to get back to. I don't mean. I'm an old police reporter, and so I don't want to get it out of academia too starkly, but I want to remind people what we're talking about. And Doctor, I'm going to ask you about this because of these shelters you're running. Kim, if you'd comment on this too. What we're really talking about here is not simply, it's nice to have good credit. Nobody likes getting those dunning phone calls. But what we're really talking about, it seems to me, is an independence that allows women to stay away from these situations. You've seen this in your shelters. The initial thing where you get a warm meal, you get around nice people, your kids stop crying, you think, oh, this is great. And about the third day, well, I can't live here. And meanwhile, your husband is calling, oh, baby, 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 I'll never do it again. I've gone to counseling. Maybe he has gone to counseling. But then the reality sets in. You have no money, you have no car, you have no credit. You're almost forced back. And this is the dynamic that I want to talk about briefly, if you could, and then Kim.
But you're not forced back.
Okay.
And that's why you have organizations like the YWCA out there making sure that you don't have to go back. Thanks to the support that we get from the government, thanks to the support we get from incredible organizations like Allstate, we have the facilities to allow people to have the time to make the decisions they need about their lives, to improve their lives, to improve their knowledge, to improve their education, so they don't have to go back. That's the whole point of the work that we do every day. When women come to our facilities, yes, that first period, we want to create a safe, warm, welcoming environment. But we then immediately begin talking about next steps. What resources do you have? How can we connect you with resources that are out there, that are available for you? But most importantly, how can we protect you from this abusive environment? Certainly, financial empowerment is very, very important. That's one of the things that we teach from the beginning. Fully, many of our YWCAs are embarking upon teaching this program, and I'm just delighted to hear the study results because, there's nothing better than knowing that what you're doing is making a difference in the lives, because this isn't a joke for these women. This is real serious business. So to know that the impact we're having is really going to be long-standing and really propel them into a better future, it's really exciting to hear the study. So I applaud everyone involved, but women don't have to go back. That's why you have organizations like the YWCA. We teach the women what resources they have, and not only do we provide the services and supports, our real competitive advantage is that we then go out and advocate to make sure that there are laws in place that protect them, that support them, that there are services out there that can sustain them while they're figuring out how they, kind of move on with their lives. So I don't want anyone to think, have this 3 days of respite and then you have to go back. You don't have to go back. Find a local YWCA. Call the hotline in NADV. Call any of your local resources. Figure out a way so you don't have to go back, because certainly so many women lose their lives as a result of domestic violence. And I just want to speak about, you asked what government can do. Another thing government can do is provide common sense gun legislation that would prevent these women from being killed. Most of the women who are killed in homicides for women are in domestic violence. So there's a lot government can do. Support organizations like the YWCA, support NADV, provide funding individually, but also make sure that the perpetrators are punished and that there's common sense legislation out there to protect women and families. Prevention also is very key too. As I mentioned, the school that some of our YWCAs have, we need to be teaching young men, it's just not okay to attack women. It's not okay. And so we need to start that at a very early age. So I challenge the notion, women don't have to go back. Please reach out to any of our YWCAs. We have 227 across the nation. Reach out to us. If we can't help you, we'll find someone who can, because we don't want you in those circumstances.
Thank you. Kim, have you seen cases where women went back to situations, abusive relationships they knew they should stay out of because they felt financially trapped?
It's actually the number one predictor of whether a woman will stay in an abusive relationship or return to an abusive relationship: economic dependency. If she's economically dependent on the abuser, often because of financial abuse committed against her, that's the number one predictor. And so if we can break that part of the cycle so that she is not economically dependent, then you eliminate the number one predictor of returning to an abusive relationship. One way government can help with that, for example, some states have done this already, is to include being a victim of domestic violence as one of the reasons that you can collect unemployment if you are forced to leave your job and flee to another city to seek safety. If you're not safe where you are, your employer.
That is not a condition now.
No, it's not. In some places it is, but it's not widespread. That would make a huge difference for a woman who is forced to leave her job and flee with her kids to be able to collect unemployment in that distant city would be life-changing for victims.
All right, well, the cat was out of the bag on guns, thank you. I'm going to ask Kim and Chelsea a question about that. Chelsea, this is your area. I'll give you the first crack, and then I got a question for Kim.
Sure.
We've been talking here about battery and financial abuse. I mean, the old term wife beating is dated, but the most serious of these abusive relationships often ends up with the victim being shot to death. You've written that a staggering portion of violence against women is fatal, and a key driver of these homicides is access to guns. So what are your policy prescriptions? What policy prescriptions would you favor to keep the guns out of abusers and stalkers?
Yeah. So teeing off of what Dara was just saying, we've done some research recently. 33% of murders of women in this country right now occur in an intimate partner context, and more than 50% of those homicides are caused by guns. So access to firearms by domestic abusers is a significant problem in this country, and it's a problem that at Center for American Progress we've been focusing on, as well as with partners in NADV and the YW and a number of other organizations to really drive attention to this issue. There are some really basic policies. The first one of which is background checks. We need a background check for every gun sale. It's estimated as high as 40% of guns change hands in this country without a background check, which is absurd. We need to make sure that the laws prohibit all of the categories of dangerous people from being able to purchase guns. The federal law has some of those in place right now. There are a few loopholes that need to be fixed. Senator Klobuchar has a bill addressing some of those, as well as Senator Blumenthal. We need to make sure that all of the records of those prohibited people make it into the background check system so that when background checks are conducted, they flag all of the right people. And then we need to make sure that prohibited domestic abusers have their guns, are relieved of their guns once they become
Let me jump in there. Recently, Every Town for Gun Safety, an organization that you know that was funded by Mike Bloomberg, looked at mass shootings in the country and found 110 of them over the last 5 years, which is itself pretty shocking. But the little-known thing is that of those shootings, 57% related to domestic or family violence. But Kim, you noted at the time you were asked about this study. Many of those killers were stalkers and convicted abusers who were already barred by federal law from owning guns.
Right, which means they stepped right through those loopholes. They bought off of a Craigslist gun sale website. They bought at a gun show, one of the areas where nobody is checking to see that they were prohibited from owning a firearm.
About when she said every gun sale.
Exactly. Every gun sale needs to have a background check, but it also needs to be expanded because one of the things we know, and I looked at that report and I looked at each of the cases, and what I also saw was that the majority of those happened after the woman had already left the relationship or was in the process of leaving. So we know that that's the most dangerous time for a woman who is a victim of domestic violence is actually when she's trying to break that power and control, when she's trying to leave the relationship. That's the most lethal time for her, and it apparently is the most lethal time for a lot of bystanders because these are mass shootings. So if that does not put a rest to why doesn't she just leave, then I don't know what would, because it's dangerous for her to leave. People need to stop asking, why doesn't she leave, and start asking, why is he beating her, and why isn't somebody doing something about it?
Right. That cheery note, I'm going to open it up to questions. Meg is giving me a signal. If you have a question for anyone on the panel, just raise your hand. Someone will come around with a microphone. I see a couple of hands. There's one. Yeah, go right there. You're there, and then up front, too.
Hi. Grace Payne-Terzian. I'm with the PR arm of the Weekly Standard and the Washington Examiner. And I want to compliment the panel. This is great work. The Allstate Foundation Real Clear Politics. Thank you for bringing this important issue to us. I was curious if with this curriculum, it sounds so helpful that to help women really understand these financial steps that they can take for freedom. To what extent is that being distributed? In other words, is there public-private partnerships getting that into the hands of churches, Jewish community centers? What means are you taking to use this tool that seems so great that you've developed? Thank you.
There's been a 10-year partnership between the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the Allstate Foundation, initially to develop the curriculum, to continue enhancing it, and then to train the trainers to deliver the curriculum. And that's what we have a large project funded by Allstate that gets trainers out into communities, into state and local organizations to train their local trainers, who then in turn deliver the curriculum to their local program, to their local shelter, to their local church or synagogue. And we are always looking for the opportunity to expand that program and to reach more individuals who will get the training in how to deliver the curriculum so that they can then in turn deliver it. We've trained over 7,000 trainers, and they have then delivered the curriculum now to over 380,000 survivors. And it's exponential. You know, it's taken us 10 years to get to that point, but now each year we have more trainers trained and they deliver the curriculum to more people. So it's expanding exponentially when we have the funding to do it.
It is also available online at clicktoempower.org. And individuals can do the curriculum themselves. They don't even have to go to a group. They can do it in the privacy of their own home. And it's an excellent tool to go through. Wow. And free for anyone who's interested.
And I would just add that at the YWCA, many of our local associations are utilizing the program. And I think it's important to note that this is not just great for domestic violence survivors. Yeah. This is a great tool for people in general to get a better handle on their finances, and it will help them throughout their life, you know, beyond the domestic violence situation. So it's a great tool.
Julie, we have a question here. Oh, sorry, Christine.
Hi, my name is Sarah Block, and I work for IUTA. We provide legal and social services to low-income immigrants in the D.C. metropolitan area. And as I'm sure you're all aware, immigrant survivors of domestic violence face specific obstacles, face another level of power and control in their immigration status. And I was wondering if you had any specific ideas in your own work of initiatives for low-income immigrant survivors of domestic violence.
Well, I'll address it because the study that we did, we collected data from 14 different domestic violence organizations across 7 states and Puerto Rico. Because of the regions we looked at, the Northeast, Texas, and Midwest, and because of the changing nature of our society, we ended up with a sample of 45% were immigrants, foreign-born. Not necessarily new immigrants, not necessarily undocumented immigrants, but and so the results apply for them as well. The curriculum is available in Spanish with hopes that it will be translated into multiple languages. So it is a helpful curriculum even for someone who is foreign-born and to learn the curriculum that way.
Any others? Oh, yeah. Are we good? Oh, one more. Okay.
Hi, my name is Kate Starr. I'm an intern with the National Organization for Women. I was wondering, since you did talk about how economic abuse hasn't actually gotten that much attention, at least not right now, and we hear a lot about how to talk to physical and emotional abuse survivors as a way to be an ally and not make them feel like we're blaming them or saying, you know, why aren't you getting out of this relationship? So you called economic abuse kind of a distinct form of abuse. Is there a distinct form of dialogue also that we just, you know, as allies, and if we have a friend who's in a situation, can kind of talk about it in a way that's appropriate? Thank you.
It is, I mean, when you think about polite society and things that we learned growing up, you never talk about politics, religion, or money. And so part of the challenge is to say it's okay to talk about money. And it's okay to have an understanding of what does a financial healthy relationship look like. If somebody in a relationship manages the bills and pays the bills and manages the checkbook, that doesn't mean it's economically abusive. But if that decision, if there was no decision in that process and the one person is managing it all without any input, any help or assistance from the partner, then that turns into a possibly abusive relationship. And so I think the questions become more of having a conversation within couples of how do they manage their money, what do they do with their money, how are financial decisions made, who has any power or say in how those decisions are made, and that in a healthy relationship, it's an equal discussion. In an unhealthy or an abusive relationship, it's when someone's using the money to control the other person. And so that's the conversation. There's tools out there. We've used a tool. It's called the Scale of Economic Abuse 12, which was a revision of an original Scale of Economic Abuse. It has 12 questions. That's why it's called 12. And it opens up some discussion of looking at those 3 different forms of abuse, whether it's economic control, economic exploitation, or employment sabotage. And so it gives you an opening dialogue that you can have with individuals about really having a better understanding of their financial relationships with significant others.
Yes.
Good morning. My name is Patricia Garza, and I work with the Allstate Foundation. And one of the areas that we are working on and have worked on for a number of years is raising public awareness of the issue and of financial abuse. And you'll be happy to know, and I hope you all join us, in September we'll be launching an expanded version of our Purple Purse campaign, which is exactly that. So look for purplepurse.com in September. You'll be able to join 145 domestic violence serving organizations from across the country where they will be raising funds from individuals for economic empowerment services. And you will be able to support that effort. Individuals actually provide more resources than a lot of corporations. And so what we're doing is using our crowdsourcing platform, CrowdRise, to help these nonprofit organizations raise funds from people like ourselves. So look forward to that. It's another way that we're bringing that home. And purplepurse.com will also offer ways for you to talk to your neighbors, to your sisters, to family members, to friends about this issue and how to overcome it. All right?
All right. With that, I'm going to wrap this up, but I want to do so by I want to thank 3 sets of people. The first is my own team. Margaret Szabo, the beautiful woman in the black dress who's been giving me stage directions, and you can all see that I need them, is our director of events. Her team includes Christina Paulos and Julia Hughes, ladies with the microphones. These events don't happen by accident. They happen through hard work. And Carrie Lemke, who works with interfaces with Allstate, with our company. And with Allstate, I was thinking of Allstate, the Good Hands people reminded me of my old friend, the late, great Phil Burton. I'll bet Kim remembers Phil.
Yes.
He was a Democratic congressman. He was my godfather, actually. And he was, and he was on, and Phil used to have this phrase when he was trying to get people to do something they didn't necessarily want to do. He'd say, Kim, you're in your mother's arms. And so I think with people like this who come here and they weren't paid. They came here because they care and out of the goodness of their heart. I feel that, and Susie Lee's, I feel that there's, we're all in our mother's arms around people like this. So I thank you, and thank Allstate, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Carl.